Right, we're really grateful for Warren Brown again staying on from his conference last week, the conference that was mentioning earlier. And Warren's the professor of psychology at the Graduate School of Psychology at Fuller Theological Seminary. He's also director of the Lee Travis Research Institute, and he's also a member of the University of California Brain Research Institute. Originally, he received his doctorate in experimental physiological psychology from the University of South California, and before that, before he was at Fuller, he was spent around 11 years as a research scientist at UCLA in the Brain Research Institute there. And Professor Brown's written and also lectured very extensively on this whole field of brain and neuropsychology. So we're enormously privileged to have him with us this afternoon. And he's going to talk to us about reconciling neuropsychology and theology. So thanks very much, Professor Brown. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'd like to thank Dennis and Rodney both for inviting me to participate, and also like to say how much I admire each one of you for still being here after this much time and this many talks and this late in the day. And I hope you'll find it worthwhile. I have a brother who's a little bit of an egotist, but he knows he is, and he jokes about it. And one time in the middle of a conversation, he says, "I got an idea. Why don't we talk about me for a while?" And I'm going to be like my brother and be an egotist and talk about myself just for a moment, because my academic life illustrates what I am doing and what I am up to and why it is I wrestle with the problems that I wrestle with. First of all, as the slide indicates, I'm at the Fuller Theological Seminary in the Graduate School of Psychology. There we have a PhD program in clinical psychology, so I'm in the middle of a theological world. But at the same time, my academic training and the kind of thing I'm really interested in doing is studying the brain. And so I'll give you an idea of the kind of thing I do in my lab with my students at Fuller Theological Seminary, of all places. We study a congenital brain abnormality called agenesis of the corpus callosum. And on the left there is an ostensibly normal brain, normal by definition. That's my brain. And I just wanted you to know I have one, first off, but also so that you know where the corpus callosum is. It's this large thing that looks like a sausage there, white structure, right in the middle of the brain. It's the largest white matter pathway in the whole brain. 200 million axons interconnect the right and left cerebral hemispheres through that structure. The individuals we study have agenesis or absence of the corpus callosum congenitally. That is, that structure is totally absent. And we have been conducting over the last 12 years probably the largest single study of individuals with this congenital disorder and a normal range of intelligence, which is the interesting thing about these people. They can have normal range intelligence and be missing such a large axonal pathway in the cerebral cortex. What we have found is that the individuals have trouble integrating information from the two visual fields, as you would expect. They have trouble coordinating the two hands. They have problems with complex novel problem solving. We've really been most interested in their general cognitive abilities as well as their social abilities. They have problem comprehending non-literal language and humor. They have subtle social comprehension deficits, not unlike high-functioning autism and Asperger's syndrome, and they have diminished imagination and creativity. That just gives you a thumbnail of what I do, so you can see I'm sitting in the middle of a big neuroscience project on a congenital brain disorder, and at the same time I'm at a theological seminary, and so that raises lots of issues that are covered or are related to the kind of things I'm going to be talking about today. So my commitments are Christian theology, but also, because I'm a neuropsychologist, a kind of physicalist or non-dualist understanding of persons, which I'll talk about. So anyway, the outline of what I'm going to tell you. You have a outline before you or some notes. Rodney asked me to give him the PowerPoint, and the PowerPoint's got lots of stuff on them that I can't distribute, but I could strip the text out of the PowerPoints, and that's mostly what you have in front of you. I'll violate that outline at one point that I'll tell you about. But anyway, I'm going to talk about first the resonance model of science and religion dialogue. Then I'm going to be talk about an overview of issues, that is, issues raised by the interrelationship between religion and science as I encounter them. I'm going to be talking about dualism versus physicalism, then human uniqueness, and then reductionism, determinism versus emergent properties. And Jeff gave 2 good talks in 2 hours, and I'm going to give 3 talks in 1 hour. And so these are 3 talks right there that I'm going to be, they're lectures I give that I've decided to kind of give you a thumbnail of, so they will not be satisfyingly complete in each case, but give you some overview, some of the things I'm interested in. If I have time, I'm going to talk about what I call the Augustinian Cartesian error, and then I'll just give some concluding remarks. First, the resonance model. The opposite of reconciling neuropsychology and theology would be what Donald Mackay called conceptual apartheid. That is, keeping the scientific and theological theories, ideas, and beliefs in separate watertight compartments so that they never mix. And the whole Faraday Institute objective, as I understand it, is to defeat conceptual apartheid. And Don Mackay was one of my mentors in all of this, and he certainly was a person who worked hard at that enterprise. But there's a question that I always have is, what are we trying to do? How do we understand what we are trying to do? And the word integration is a word that Jeff used that is used a lot in this context, and a word that expresses some things, but some things also I don't like, and that is the idea that somehow religion and science could be integrated, such as they say the same things, sort of a grand religio-scientific theory of everything. And I really don't, for me, that's not where I am trying to arrive. So I developed this metaphor. It's a acoustic auditory metaphor of resonance, and I developed it this way. Within this model, the objective of the dialogue between religion and science is not to integrate information in the sense of having them say the same thing or to agree on every point, but rather to find resonance and avoid dissonance. And so in this model, first of all, there's more than 2 domains, and I think we have to realize that science and religion does not capture all of the domains we have to take into account. In fact, you can add to this model as many as you'd like. It would still operate. But certainly we have science, which is our systematic observations of the natural world, both the social world and the physical world. Rationality would be things like philosophy, so this would have to have some resonance with philosophy. Also systematic theology, mathematics, or rational systems. Here in experience, I mean our subjective experiences of being a person, as well as subjective religious experiences and other kinds of data from our personal selves. Traditions both of our cultures and families, but also our religious traditions. And then in most religious traditions, you have some scriptural revelation, some authoritative documents that one has to deal with. The object then is that we stand somewhere in the middle of all this, and truth or understanding would probably be a more postmodern word, but our understanding of truth is mostly found in the resonant field between these, where we are looking to find some amount of resonance and to avoid dissonance. And so if I were to cartoon this word would be becoming fuzzy and clear, and these radiating lines would be, moving like sound waves, and so at various points in the resonant field, things would be clearer than at other points. The most important part of this model, and the reason I use these old-fashioned radios, is they have knobs, and that you can it illustrates the fact of tuning. And I think that our objective is within each of these areas, within the acceptable range of interpretations of information from that area, we tune the knobs. That is, we find an acceptable interpretation for the data from that field that is most resonant with the other fields. So when we were talking about evolutionary theory and its relationship to religion, we're interested in, within the acceptable range of evolutionary theory, which understanding of evolutionary theory and evolutionary data is most resonant with other areas. But we might find, in fact, that there are some things that are just flat dissonant with our understanding of revelation or tradition or our personal experiences, and maybe those have to also be tuned in some sense in order to obtain resonance. So this is just the way I think about what we're doing. For one thing, it doesn't allow any field to trump all the others, at least within domains where everybody has something to say. If your statement of truth is about the molecular membrane of the neuron, then perhaps science is the only voice. But if from that information about neuroscience you want to make some conclusions about aspects of human nature, then you have other things to take into account, and I think you're looking for resonance. It's a metaphor. Don't press me too hard on it. It probably has some holes in it, but it helps me understand all the things I'm dealing with and what I'm trying to do with those areas of information. So the issues then that I think are create dissonance between religion and science, at least in the areas that I work, are first of all the issue of body-soul dualism versus physicalism. That is, if we have a soul, what does it do that the body does not do? Do we need the concept of a soul? Do we need to? And this implies some adjustments, I think, in our theological understanding of the person. Another, this is the topic that we took up in the book, Whatever Happened to the Soul, that is on the book stand back there. It was a book really about the nature of human nature, in which we looked at theological, philosophical, and scientific status of concepts like soul and mind and the nature of persons. So another issue then is evolution and human nature, and we've been talking about that. And part of that is the issue of human uniqueness. If we evolved from apes, what is to be understood of the image of God, of the uniqueness of humankind? In what sense are we just simply a part of the biological world, and in what respect might we occupy some unique position in that world? And this, I think, involves some adjustments both in our cognitive neuroscience and in our theology. I think there's a number of things to be thought about in that case. And then the idea of reductionism and determinism versus free will. If humans are presumed to be essentially physical, is it inevitable that personhood will be reduced to nothing but biology? And this, I think, takes some adjustments, if nothing else, in our understanding of neuroscience. This is a topic that Nancy Murphy and I took up in a book that is still in press, Did My Neurons Make Me Do It? Philosophical and Neurobiological Perspectives on Moral Agency and Free Will. So I'll take up the first one of those. We'll take up all three of those. At this point, I'm actually at number 4 in your outline. I reordered number 3 and number 4, so you may want to move forward. And this is the issue or the problem of bodies and souls versus, in a dualist sense, versus a physicalist sense. So I think about this by putting forth 2 propositions that are sort of at this extreme end of this dialogue. One is Proposition 1. Humans are neurobiological beings whose mind, also soul and religious experience, can in theory be exhaustively explained by neurochemistry and ultimately by physics. And this is what's called eliminative materialism. Humans are nothing but a mass of molecules. It's believed by some scientists and philosophers, certainly not all. it's ethically problematic. If you think about it very long, it's very difficult to come up with a convincing ethic in this sort of reductionism. And it's theologically unacceptable primarily for that reason. This is what Donald Mackay called nothing buttery. You've heard this term used before. Mackay says, according to this view, only where physical explanation was impossible could any other account be taken seriously in its own right. Otherwise, the whole thing could be explained away as nothing but the mindless motion of molecules. And I like that last phrase, the mindless motion of molecules. So that's one position. Position two would be that humans are physical beings who also have non-material souls. And it is the soul that is spiritual that allows us to experience and relate to God. This is classic body-soul dualism. It has a philosophical line that you can roughly trace from Plato to St. Augustine to Descartes. And it pervades the modern, particularly popular Christian view. Again, I don't know about other religions, but certainly for popular Christian faith, this is the predominant view. I think many theologians are moving away from this view, but certainly not all. So, and certainly from my perspective, where I sit in the world, this is definitely problematic. And here's why it's problematic. It's becoming increasingly difficult to find an area of human cognitive, affective, social, moral, or religious functioning that has not already been shown to have correlates and identifiable patterns of brain functioning. And so you have a strong indication, not a conclusive proof, but a strong indication that many of the kind of things that we have attached to the idea of having a soul are embodied in particular ways in our nervous systems. And so I'm going to run through real quickly some studies that make that point. Jeff's given you a couple of them I usually use that are not here, so Jeff's done part of my work for me in the study of inclusion and exclusion, for example, or the study of trust and moral, work with oxytocin and trust, for example. But let me give you some others. First of all, moral reasoning or moral behavior. This is a famous case called the case of Phineas Gage, whom anybody in neurology or anybody studying neuroscience knows this case. It's talked about a lot, but it illustrates a point of which there are many cases like this, and that is damage to this medial and orbital part of the frontal cortex leaves a person unable to regulate their behavior in such a way to act morally. They're capricious and amoral. Certainly Phineas Gage was. So moral behavior has a nestedness in our neurobiology. The experience of regret. This is a study looking at people with actually damage to very much the same area who do not experience regret. They set up a experiment in which you make choices and you can then monitor how much regret they experience, and individuals with damage to this area do not experience regret. Pardon? What was what? That has to do with the depth in the brain, the level of the MRI scan from a coordinate system, a Talairac coordinate system. Moral decision making. This is comparison using functional magnetic resonance imaging in normally functioning human beings in a situation where they're making easy versus hard moral decisions. And more difficult moral decisions activate the anterior and posterior cingulate gyrus as well as the dorsal lateral areas of the frontal cortex. So moral decision making. But the more interesting is recent work by Josh Green and others in which you compare making a moral decision that does not require specific interpersonal action as opposed to a moral decision that does require interpersonal action. In this case, it's a hypothetical where a train is coming down the track. You can throw the switch. If you throw the switch, the train goes one way, one person is killed, 5 persons are saved. But in the other version of it, they're standing there, the train coming down the track. You can push a person in front of the train. 1 person is killed. The 5 people on the train are saved, but you have to physically push a person in front of the train. And people make very different kinds of decisions often when this is the case. And just the process of thinking about that kind of a decision activates the anterior cingulate area, and bilateral angular gyrus and some other areas. So there's an embodiment of those kinds of moral decision making. Religious experiences, this is the work of Andy Newberg, and has been paraded around a lot, but illustrates a number of different studies done on brain correlates of religious experiences. Here you have Buddhist monks meditating. At the point of time they reach some state of oneness, they press a little button, a dye is injected into their brain, they're rushed off to a SPECT scanner, and these kind of images are obtained where the meditation versus baseline involves activation of frontal areas as well as deactivation of the right parietal lobe. And Newberg and de Aguili make a lot out of that pattern of brain activity. But there are other things. There's a long history in neurology of the relationship between intense religious experiences and temporal lobe seizures, that in some cases, certainly not all cases, individuals with temporal lobe seizures will have intense religious experiences. If you want to read a good account of that, in Dostoevsky's The Idiot, Prince Myshkin has seizures and describes his seizure, the aura leading up to the seizure, in a grand and glorious religious experience. Safer and Rubin have talked about a limbic marker hypothesis of religious experiences. That is, the limbic system tags certain encounters as crucially important, harmonious, and or joyous, prompting comprehension of these experiences within a religious framework. Well, you can do that one better, and that is you can actually electromagnetically stimulate the brain. This is the transcranial magnetic stimulation, and if this is a stimulator here instead of stimulating there, you moved around actually not to the left temporal lobe but to the right temporal lobe and used electromagnetic stimulation. Michael Persinger has suggested that transcranial magnetic stimulation of the right temporal lobe significantly increases reports of presence. And not every person, but a lot of their subjects reported this as a spiritual presence. So you can actually experimentally manipulate this. Persinger thinks that persons who have religious experiences are having micro seizures of the right temporal lobe. Now there's a reductionist statement for you. And he thinks there are similar explanations can be given to paranormal experiences, such as reports of encounters with aliens. And he has this whole theory about electromagnetic fields in the Alamogordo area of New Mexico, where people report a lot of aliens. So the point of all this is not to be exhaustive in the explanation, but just to give you some feel for the issue. The theologian Pannenberg said, when the life of the soul is conditioned in every detail by bodily organs and processes, how can it be detached from the body and survive? And that's the problem that is created by body-soul dualism within the context of modern neuroscience. It's hard to figure out what parts of the person you would attach to a soul that aren't convincingly bodily embodied in us physically. So there's an alternative point of view that we have been working with and is called non-reductive physicalism. Physicalism indicates it's not necessary to postulate a second ontological entity, the soul or mind, to account for human capacities and distinctiveness. Soul and mind are physiologically embodied. And that's not controversial in certain scientific senses, but whether or not it's reductively embodied is the question. And so we talk about non-reductive physicalism, that is, human behavior cannot be exhaustively explained by analysis at lower levels. Higher level properties emerge, top-down causation exists, thinking is efficacious, and you can expand on that. So this is the approach we took in Whatever Happened to the Soul, and I'll just run by quickly what I attempted to do in Whatever Happened to the Soul. First of all, I argued that soul is a quality of humanness, not a thing or a part. Theologian Dunn would differentiate between partitive and aspective understanding of the soul. Partitive would be the soul and the body are two different parts. Aspective would be the soul is an aspect of an embodied human being, and that's the position I took. I preferred the term then soulish and soulishness as more clearly implying a quality, and those aren't real good words, but they do some work, and the work they do is they preserve a concept that has been of value in religious conversation in a way that doesn't make it partitive, that doesn't make soul a part, but allows it to be aspective. And then I argued, and this is, I think, a most important part of my arguments there, that soulishness is best understood as the capacities and experiences of personal relatedness. So if you were to go and look for what kinds of capacities and experiences we might be talking about, I think they're most captured by the concepts and experiences of personal relatedness. And that would have then to to include three parts. First, the qualitative and quantitative differences between humans and non-humans in inter-individual relatedness, and this is some of what Jeff was talking about. Differences in depth, scope, complexity, and range in time, space, and topic. Certainly, animals are social and related, but there's a difference between the depth of relatedness in humankind that I would think help us understand what we might be thinking about when we're talking about soulishness or souls. Also, the subjective or intrapersonal process of self-relatedness and self-representation, which also allows for self-evaluation. And then, from my own theological perspective, the experiences of being related to God. So the implications then of non-reductive physicalism as an alternative view to dualism or eliminative materialism can be just summed up: we are bodies, we don't have bodies. Or to put it the other way around, we are souls, we don't have souls. That these in fact are embodied part of our human nature. So that's one lecture, one sort of thumbnail of a lecture. I just talked at the International Society for Science and Religion about human uniqueness. If you're going to have an embodied person, persons that are physical, and at the same time then physically evolved from lower species, then how do we understand human uniqueness? A non-dualist answer would probably have something to do with the brain, since the brain is the most remarkable aspect of humankind. And Simon this morning was talking about brain size. This is just a slide that illustrates brain size. This is the actual comparison of sizes on a relative scale. You see that we don't have actually the largest brains. Dolphins, whales, elephants all have larger brains than us. So it's not brain size per se, but Simon was talking about the encephalization ratio, and that's the relationship between brain size and body size. So we have body size on this scale and brain size on this scale, and this solid line for higher vertebrates is the general prediction of brain size from body size, and encephalization is the degree to which a particular species moves away from that line of the relationship between brain size and body size. So there's humans right up there. The cephalization ratio is larger for humans than for any of the other species. But it's not also just encephalization ratio, it's actually size of the cerebral cortex. And is relatively larger even given our relative brain size. And in fact, it's even more interesting than that. It's not just the size of our cerebral cortex, but it's the size of the cerebral cortex not devoted to primary motor and sensory information. So in a rat, cat, and human, you can see the areas of brain not colored, and those are the areas that are not involved in primary sensory and motor area. They're a more integrative secondary and tertiary information processing area, and that's what's most unique about human brains is the amount of association cortex within the cerebral cortex that is larger within a brain that is larger relative at least to our body size. So those three areas are the inferior temporal cortex, the area of juncture between the occipital, temporal, and parietal lobes, and the prefrontal cortex. And I want to concentrate, just for the sake of simplicity, on the prefrontal cortex for a couple of reasons you'll see. So the prefrontal cortex has expanded to encompass a greater and greater percentage of the total cerebral cortex. What you see here is the prefrontal area in dark there. For a cat, it's about 4% of the total cerebral cortex, about 10% in dog, and approximately the same or maybe up as much as 12% in monkeys, 17% in chimpanzees, but 29% of the entire cerebral cortex is the prefrontal cortex in the human brain. So this relative expansion of the prefrontal cortex. Another thing important, two other things important about the prefrontal cortex. One is it's characterized by extensive two-way recurrent or interactions between the frontal lobes and other areas of the cerebral cortex. So there's a lot of back and forth information flow. Secondly, we were talking about developmental issues. It's one of the latest areas to develop. In fact, the prefrontal cortex is still being myelinated into the 20s, into the third decade of life. And there's arguments going on actually in legal areas as to how responsible is a teenager for their actions if in fact their frontal lobes are not entirely myelinated, which is an interesting ethical question. Joaquin Fuster, from whom this slide comes, is one of the experts on the prefrontal cortex, has done a lot of work on single neuron systems in the prefrontal cortex and the interaction between prefrontal and temporal and prefrontal and motor cortex. And Fuster summarizes the functions of the cerebral cortex in his book as including these. First of all, the temporal integration of behavior. That is the ability to sustain behavior over a longer period of time and to predict as well as to use historical information. Working memory, which to some degree is the same thing, that is the ability to hold information in mind long enough to extend over periods of time. Some of Fuster's work involved giving cues, then having a wait time and watching what the frontal lobe does during the wait time. The frontal lobe keeps the information activated in the other sensory areas of the brain during the wait period, and then the animal can make a choice. But it also involves working memory. It involves the manipulation of information. It's also critical in attention, ability to maintain a focus, to both filter out both external and internal information, such as to maintain a focus and direction of thought and behavior. Preparatory set. Part of the experiments have shown that as the time for the response comes about, the frontal lobe begins to activate areas in the motor cortex and prepares the animal for action, so preparation for action. And inhibitory control, that is ability to inhibit impulsive behavior. And to the degree then that humankind has enlarged frontal lobes, humans then have extended and enhanced capacity to project behavior over time, to manipulate information and working memory, to maintain attentional focus, to prepare for behavior in the future, and to inhibit impulsive behavior. I talked about the recurrent and two-way interactions between the frontal cortex and the rest of the brain, and it really sets up an understanding of the cortex in general and the participation of the frontal lobes in the idea of a dynamic system that I'll talk about later. But this quote I like from Fuster. He says that as networks fan out and upward in association, and particularly frontal cortex, they become capable of generating novel representations that are not reducible to their inputs or to their individual neuronal components. Those representations are the product of complex, nonlinear, near chaotic interactions between innumerable elements of high-level networks that are removed from sensory receptors and motor effectors. Then top-down network building predominates. Imagination, creativity, and intuition are some of the cognitive attributes of those emergent high-level representations. And part of the reason I give that is I want to come back to that idea of networks and emergence. Interesting thing I've run into recently is the von Economo neuron. We're working with some scientists at Caltech on agenesis of the corpus callosum. One of the scientists involved is John Allman, who is a neuroanatomist and has been working with these neurons. And the von Economo neuron is a distinctive shaped neuron. It's a very large neuron that sends axons over the majority of the cerebral cortex. It is found, this is the pyramidal cell, the other very large neuron. They're distinctive in shape. Here's some von Economo neurons and pyramidal cells. These neurons are found only in two areas, in the anterior cingulate cortex and in the frontoinsular cortex. Now, the frontoinsular cortex is a part of or associated with the insular cortex. The insular cortex is receiving information about autonomic and other bodily states, blood pressure, heart rate, muscle tension, a lot of things that code information that is important in our emotional life and our emotional responsiveness. What is most interesting about these neurons is that they are fairly unique, not completely, to the human brain. So here is neuronal counts of von Economo neurons. In the apes, average about 7,000. In a newborn human, about 28,000. But in a 4-year-old child, up to 184,000. In an adult human, 193,000. So they're relatively unique neurons in human brains. They occur in chimpanzees and gorillas, but nothing lower. And so they're not present. And in terms of John Allman's theory, this is important because it's the communication of interoceptive information to the rest of the cerebral cortex. So humankind would have a greater ability to integrate interoceptive, emotional, whatever information into the general cognitive networks. And the most interesting thing, or the reason Allman is pursuing this so intensely right now, is he has a theory that autism is a defect in the development of von Economo neurons, that it develops around an age trajectory that is similar to the emergence of autism. But it would be interesting for the nature of humankind to understand, to know what is the consequences, for example, of absence of von Economo neurons. Well, so much for neuroanatomy. Let me talk a little bit The other thing I was going to say is the areas where von Economou neurons arise are very close to and around the kind of areas that get damaged in the orbital frontal or medial frontal brain damage. The anterior cingulate cortex would be right there and often damaged, so it may be that some of the clinical symptoms of individuals with this sort of brain damage are due to this damage to this neuronal system. So much for neuroanatomy. Let me talk about sort of functional brain activity and functional systems. Language is probably the functionally and cognitively the most unique system in humankind. It certainly has a relatively unique functional distribution that is a lateralized distribution. The interesting thing about this slide is this from infants listening to speech, and these are pre-linguistic infants who have not yet mastered language, and you already have a left lateralized language processing system. So there's something unique and perhaps even genetic about the lateralization and development of the human language system. Now there's a lot of experiments that have been interested in whether or not chimps can develop language, and Kanzi here is the star of chimpanzee linguistic experiments. Kanzi had the benefit of being raised from an infant in a language experiment that Kanzi's mother was a part of, and Kanzi was just tagging along, and when given an opportunity to engage in the experiments himself, Kanzi was an immediate star doing the system. At one point, it was also found that he could comprehend some spoken language, and in fact they did a test of something like 700 different spoken English sentences, of which Kanzi responded appropriately to something like 70% of them. So, but there's, so he was able to master significant expressive and receptive language. Certainly receptive better than expressive. But here's the question. Charles Saunders Peirce has talked about language being, or communication systems being analyzable into icons, which signify by mere resemblance, and indices that are based on learned associations between signs and that which they signify, but symbols having meaning established by language convention and by the networks of semantic relationships with other symbols. And so the question now has been, to what degree can chimps be shown to have true symbolic language? Terence Deacon talks about the symbolic threshold and the symbolic insight, that somewhere in evolution humans have achieved a symbolic insight that he says must be achieved anew by each infant in development. So the question really is, has Kanzi achieved a symbolic insight, or is this merely the best expression of indexical language, and it's probably maybe a little of both. But but the question here, or the reason for bringing this up, is that although language is so characteristic of humankind, you can find proto-language or some ability to handle language in chimps. So like von Economou neurons, you know, a little bit in a chimpanzee under the right circumstances, not in the wild by themselves, but you know, incredibly enhanced language capacity in humankind. And if, in fact, humans are unique in symbolic language, that would confer a quality and to cognition. This is Terence Deacon's list of contributions of language to human cognition and behavior, and just probably cites a few of the possibilities. One is the distancing of action from the demands of immediate motivation and needs. Second, the ability to form a self-concept, a representation of the self, and with the self-concept, then the possibility for self-evaluation. Expanded empathy, in, for example, stories, the ability to empathize with another person through the narrative, a virtual common mind among groups of people, the sharing of ideas through language, and ethics. There are other areas that people have talked about on occasion that seem to be cognitive properties that might be uniquely human, and let me just run through a few of those. One is a theory of mind. Simon talked about this morning. That's the theory of the knowledge, beliefs, and mental states of other persons, or the ability to accurately attribute mental states and impute intentionality and purpose to other people. And there's been a lot of research done with chimpanzees and the possibility of a theory of mind. And the conclusion is they do have a theory of mind to some degree. And in fact, what Simon was saying this morning, that it appears to be that certain birds have a theory of mind, or at least a proto-theory of mind, or that something at least that operates like a theory of mind in some context. So, and one of the interests in terms of human neuropsychology and theory of mind is it seems to be an area in which individuals with autism have a particular difficulty. Foresight, planning ahead. There's a recent article in Science just in this year that apes can anticipate the future need for a tool, and in one case is described as anticipation extending over a 14-hour period. So the ability to anticipate the future, people have talked about as being uniquely human, but there are some remnants of this or some proto-anticipation or small degrees of anticipation in apes. Insight, there's the classic work of Wolfgang Kohler on Tenerife with chimpanzees during World War I, and in which he makes a lot of argument for the possibility of insight in apes. And this is Sultan, who is solving a problem of getting two bananas by joining two sticks. And the scenario was that he tried and tried with the sticks unjoined and got upset and went and sat in the corner and sulked, and after a while suddenly jumps up, runs over, connects the rods, gets the bananas. And the anecdotal, at least, implication is that this was an indication of insight in apes. But at least it suggests that something about insight might be, you might be able to find in chimps. Altruism, this is what Jeff was talking about this morning. This is a very recent, last week or so, abstract from an article by Warneken and Tomasello. And I'll just read it. Altruistic behaviors toward non-kin are extremely rare evolutionarily, with some theorists, and I underline this, some theorists even proposing that they are uniquely human. Children as young as 18 months of age quite readily help others to achieve their goals in a variety of different situations. This requires both an understanding of the other's goals and an altruistic motivation to help. Similar, though less robust skills and motivations were demonstrated in 3 young chimpanzees. So altruism, at least to some degree, can be demonstrated to exist in chimpanzees. I think that there's another point of this, by the way, and that is that when you find these things like language in chimpanzees, it always seems to be that it mimics about what you find in young children, maybe up to 2 or 3 years of age, maybe pushing at 4 years of age. And then chimps top out no matter how much you train them, whereas children continue to develop. I'll just give you the conclusion I gave in this paper at the International Society for Science and Religion. My title was Non-Reductive Human Uniqueness, Immaterial, Biological, or Psychosocial. And I said that whatever is unique about humankind is not immaterial, as in a non-material soul or mind. At least this was my conclusion. That neuroanatomical and cognitive differences are arguably, and that's still an argument, merely enhancements of the same structures and capacities found in other primates. Therefore, human uniqueness is not biological or cognitive. whatever is unique is emergent in the sense of human properties and qualities that come about as individuals self-assemble and self-organize in interaction with psychosocial environments. That it's not the hardware, and it's not necessarily the cognitive capacities per se, but it's the way these are used in combination as one interacts and self-organizes within a complex social structure. Therefore, humanness is a non-reductive property, or human uniqueness is a non-reductive property in the sense of an emergent property. So I would say that uniqueness is embodied, that is, it's a part of our physical existence, but it is also embedded, that it is contextualized in interactions with society and culture. So the next issue, reductionism and determinism. If humans are presumed to be essentially physical, is it inevitable that we would reduce them to nothing but biology? So here's a statement of the problem from Nancy Murphy. She states, if mental events are intrinsically related to neural events, how can it not be the case that the contents of mental events are ultimately governed by the laws of neurobiology? If neurobiological determinism is true, then it would appear that there is no freedom of the will, that moral responsibility is in jeopardy, and that our talk about the role of reasons in any intellectual discipline is misguided. And this gets us to the idea of emergence, which denotes, at least in my terminology, the fact that more complex entities can have properties that do not exist within the parts that make up the complex entity. And I think that dynamic systems theory gives a good account of the emergence of causal properties in complex interactive systems based solely upon whole part constraints on the behavior of the lower level parts that together make up the larger system. Whole part constraint allows of the parts in systems allows for the emergence of properties. So what is necessary for a complex dynamic system to emerge and have emergent properties? Here's some of the things. Complexity, that is a very large number of elements, and certainly in the case of the human brain, that would be neurons. Maximal interconnectivity, a very large number of synapses per neuron would satisfy that. Lots of possibilities for interaction. Two-way interaction between elements, recurrent connections, recursion and reafference, as it's called in the nervous system. And then nonlinear interactions that amplify small perturbations and small differences in initial conditions. If you have this kind of complex system, you have the possibility of a dynamic system with emergent properties coming about. Just so that I'm sure you're convinced that the brain is complex, but I'll give you a visual of it. This is all of the visual areas, all the areas of the brain involved in vision in the macaque brain. So here's the side view of the brain, here's the medial view, and if you flatten that out, you get this view. All the colored areas are the areas that are involved just in vision in some way. Now, this is the work of Fellman and Van Essen, and what they have provided is something like a wiring diagram of those areas. These are all the interconnections between those areas, and it's not exaggerating at all to say this vastly underestimates the connections between areas or the complexity within each one of those areas. The complexity is extensive even within each area. So that kind of complexity suggests the possibility that the system could operate in this manner. So here's the characteristics of dynamic systems. This is largely from the work of Alicia Guerrero, who's a philosopher who is interested in action theory and believes that dynamic systems solve a lot of the problems of action theory, the emergent property. So first of all, that dynamic systems self-organize when they are pushed far from equilibrium. They organize into patterns, systems, and those patterns and systems contain information about the environment within which they are organizing. Elements become entrained by larger patterns. Large perturbations of the system cause reorganization of the system. That is, the system has adaptability and flexibility. So it can change over time. However, the integrity and history of the system is preserved. That is, there is resilience. Or reorganization is always with respect to its previous organization. So in that sense, it maintains its history. Small perturbations do not change the system. That is, the systems have a certain sense of robustness. And the properties of the system are probabilistic tendencies. That is, they can be described as attractors and repellers in a probabilistic space. And the systems manifest novelty. That is, you can't predict. If you're running a computer simulation of a truly dynamic system, you can't predict where it's going to come out. It'll come out in different ways in different runs of the system. And so Alicia Rorero, in her last chapter, talks about free will with respect to dynamic systems. And I think this gives us some leverage in thinking about this free will in a physicalist understanding of persons. She suggests that dynamic systems respond or act more and more from their own point of view. That is, once organized and organized in a way that's somewhat robust, the system reacts or interacts from its own point of view, not entirely dependent on the stimulus environment. Reducing potential internal variation by organizing into attractors and repellers paradoxically increases the range of possibilities of the system as a whole. So the system as a whole has a greater degrees of freedom as it continues to reorganize, but that organization comes about by constraints on the elements of the system. Because the system self-organizes in interaction with the environment, the organization embodies meaning. So one of the problems in action theory is how does systems embody meaning? And that continual reorganization with respect to the environment means that higher and higher levels of semantic considerations can be expressed in the behavior. So the systems continually reorganize, and often the previous organizations are the elements for the new level of organization. So you have the possibility of creating a hierarchical sets of controls and systems. And then once meaning and values have been embodied in the self-organization of the system, certain behavioral alternatives are excluded by the semantic space. So in that sense, it is behaving more and more from its own point of view. Well, I believe that emergence can be defined and seen and understood at least partially, if not completely, from the point of view of dynamic system theories. At least it gives us a conceptual tool. The term emergence has been thrown around without a lot of substance to it, and I think this begins to give us some substance. Where are we on time? Huh? Okay. Yeah, okay. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to bounce through that. We can talk about that later if we want. And just give my concluding summary, which is that I think there could kind of summarize my feeling about brain systems and humanness in three possibilities. One is that humans are physical systems that are closed and near equilibrium. Therefore, behavior is determined by physical laws, and this is the eliminative materialism or reductionism. Second is humans are physical systems that are somehow open to influence from a non-material part, a mind or a soul. Therefore, humans have free will or uniqueness or spirituality or whatever else in virtue of the non-material part, and this is dualism. And then the possibility I've been suggesting is that humans are physical systems that are open, far from equilibrium, ultra-complex and nonlinear. Within such systems, high-level properties emerge that are causally efficacious and manifest a robust and reasonable form of free will. Humans are religious and spiritual beings due to what emerges in interacting with the world in which we inhabit. And that's all I have. Thank you.